Hi, I'm Cynthia Rothschild. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and I've been an activist focusing on issues of sexuality and HIV and human rights for about 18 years now. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about issues of sexuality and how they connect to violence against women, and the ways in which it's not quite uncharted territory, but there's a way that UN bodies, governments, and even people within human rights organizations and women's organizations still are not quite focusing on the ways in which control over women's bodies and control over women's sexuality it's actually a considerable risk factor for violence against women. And when I say that, I don't explicitly mean sexuality in a narrow sense. I'm not only talking about sexual orientation, although certainly that is a key issue. Lesbians around the world are targeted by state and also non-state actors to punish their desire, to punish their attraction. But I do mean this more broadly, because I think that women overall experience regulation of our sexuality, of our reproduction, of our decisions about who we partner with, who we marry, whether we decide to have children. Certainly we're discriminated against in the context of healthcare, often in a context of education, etc. So I do mean I cast a wide net in terms of how our bodies are regulated. And when I do talk about sexuality, I think that sexual orientation is often an unmentioned piece, but it's not the only factor that puts women at risk. Now, with that said, I do think it's accurate to say that lesbians are targeted for various forms of violence, unilaterally around the world. That's true in the global north and the global south. It's true in the east and the west. It's true in developing states and so-called industrial states. Lesbians in particular are at risk not only at the hands and decision-making of UN officials, government officials, but also in what we tend to call the private sphere. Lesbians are at risk in the home and in the community, and are often punished because of attraction and desire, same-sex attraction and desire. And one of the key challenges that we face in surfacing this abuse is the fact that on a global level, lesbians tend not to report violence directed at us. There's a lot of risk involved in going to the police, or there's a lot of risk involved in going to our families, or to religious officials, or to the media. So we tend not to report violence. And then that leads to a cycle of the stories of our lives and the stories of that violence never really being surfaced properly. We also have found over the past decades in which people have been talking about violence against lesbians, we find too that human rights organizations, the very organizations that in other circumstances would be allies in helping individual survivors to seek redress, even human rights organizations don't necessarily know how to take on issues of sexuality. They don't necessarily consistently know how to get at the particulars. They don't know necessarily how to get at the fears that women have in reporting. There are certainly confidentiality issues, and there are a lot of reasons why lesbians choose not to report. But human rights organizations must become more sensitive and more efficient in the investigation and in the reporting of these violations, because often it's step one, in seeking redress. Women won't ordinarily immediately go to police. They'll go to either an activist organization or a service organization seeking help, if they choose to do this at all. And if those kinds of organizations aren't set up to properly to properly hear from women who've experienced these kinds of violence, then it becomes a bad cycle because the women themselves are not treated properly in the process. And then in the longer term, the cases, the documentation, the investigation, the punishment of perpetrators, it's left by the wayside. So the perpetrators act with impunity, and that fuels additional violence, in part because perpetrators know that they can get away with certain kinds of violence, that they won't be punished. So it becomes critically important for women's organizations and human rights organizations and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender organizations to work together to learn from one another in how to properly investigate and document and provide support for women who are experiencing violations and violence because of same-sex attraction. For more information about any of these issues in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, and violence against women, people can go to major human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, both of whom have programs in these areas and documentation. There's a fair amount of reporting that they have done on these issues. Many women's organizations around the world as well can provide resources. There are lesbian organizations, there are lesbian and gay organizations, there's the International Lesbian and Gay Association. There are organizations such as the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. Then there are also organizations that focus on these issues and advocacy at the UN, such as ARC International. The International Service for Human Rights has also been engaging in advocacy on these issues. And I think the most important thing to say is that if you have experienced violations or violence, the most important thing you can do is go to the spaces where you feel most comfortable reporting those violations. Don't go alone. Go with allies who can help to support you. And the good news is that on a global level, there's so much LGBT advocacy now that in many places there are means of accessing. So there are two reports that the Center for Women's Global Leadership has issued in recent years that touch on a number of these issues. One is called Written Out: How Sexuality is Used to Attack Women's Organizing. That's a publication of the Global Center, so get in touch with us. It's also downloadable online. There's another report that we've issued recently that looks at women's experience connecting HIV and violence against women. And that report is called Strengthening Resistance, Confronting Violence Against Women and HIV. And that also has a resource section, as does Written Out, that might be particularly useful for activists, survivors, policymakers, decision makers, etc.